I used to be a school principal, and the best piece of advice I ever got was that in all your decisions you should place a child at the centre of it. Because in all your interactions with the Board of Management or the patron body or Department of Education or staff or parents, as long as there's a child at the centre of your decision, then nobody can ever question your integrity. You won't always win, but keep that focus. And what I found since I've begun into politics is that very few people advocate for children, really. Boards of management will be advocating for the school. Teacher unions will advocate for teachers. Patron bodies advocate for the ethos of their schools. But it's very difficult to get a body that actually advocate purely and simply for the rights of the child. So in my part of the world, we have exasperated parents who can't get assessments, can't get basic interventions that any other European country would take as a norm. They have incredibly elongated waiting lists. 72 months has been said to me on a number of occasions for various different interventions. And then we have this sort of bizarre scenario. It's not bizarre, it's cruel and it's wrong, of trying to get your child into the local school. I mean, imagine the humiliation of going to your local school gate and be told that there's no place for you because of what your child is like. And they just have come to the conclusion they just have to accept this and go from school to school to school to school, 17 schools, 19 schools, 20 schools. And then we have this new provision from the department, which I almost feel, and I don't want to be unfair to the department, but this is an area that they don't embrace. They don't love. They don't celebrate. It feels like it's a massive drag on their resources and the money that they have to spend. And I know that because even within the system, SNAs aren't respected. In many schools, staff rooms are not respected. They're not even called, you'll call the teacher by their second name, but the SNA will be called by their first name. That's a deliberate hierarchical decision made within staff rooms. You know, it's Miss Kyo and Bernie, right? So, right? And then I know myself, when I stepped into that space as a teacher, I was the de facto substitute for the year, right? It's like, well, you're not really doing a very productive job. Miss so-and-so is out. Would you just step into her class for the day? So that level of disrespect at the local level, and then I believe at the national level as well. So, and then you have a parent who feels that they have to go to war for basic provisions. So I don't even know what I'm asking you, but maybe you might have to reflect on some of the things I've said. How can we get to the point? And maybe I am of the belief that we possibly have at primary level too many schools. Now, a politician saying that means that somebody will immediately accuse me of wanting to close down schools. Not necessarily. I feel we have too many schools that have a small amount of enrolment, and if they had a bigger enrolment, could easily, assume all the challenges that are presented to them in their own geographical area. I'm fascinated by the Finnish model, where every single child in that jurisdiction around the school, has an absolute right to attend that school, must attend that school. There's never any question around resources. Never, ever, ever would it ever be a question mark over facilitating a child, regardless of their background. How do we come to a situation where we can achieve that? And secondly, just on the more recent thing, the minister says that 66% of schools will not be affected by the new allocation model, which by my basic maths means that 34% will, and she said by no more than 5 hours. Can you give a kind of an? I mean, you may have already done this, so apologies if I'm late to the conversation. Give us some kind of a picture as to what that will really mean for that 34% of schools. So maybe Adam, I don't know if you want to reflect on some of the things I've said there. I know we've had some communication in the last period of time over this.
Thank you, Deputy, and I think you captured very well what is the experience that we hear from families day in, day out. I think that there is a certain sense when it comes to planning in this area, when it comes to supports in this area, that it's constant reactivity as opposed to being proactive. And indeed, we see that in big ways when we look at issues like this, where we're planning year to year. We're not looking ahead into the future and addressing problems before they arise. But I think we actually see it on the micro level with individual families as well, because very often our families are at sea. And what we actually see is a scenario in which a child's rights nearly have to be breached before they can actually be maintained or upheld. And we see that whether it comes to school places, we see that, as we were talking about in our opening statements, with a very concerning return to soft barriers. Quite a number of families told in recent days, your child now can't continue in mainstream next year. Your child isn't actually welcome here because we're not going to get the hours for complex needs. Now that might be unlawful, but there's very few people there to help. And that is the reality. Indeed, if a family is unhappy with its allocation that their child is receiving in this current model, they will be directed to a school's complaints process. Your child might be in 2nd class and they might find out in 5th class they should have got the support they needed this year. It's an elongated model that's not created to support the child or to vindicate their rights, but very often to frustrate it, in which the whole dynamic and power goes to the school. I mean, from our point of view, fundamentally, we need to get to a place where we're talking not about charity, but we're talking about rights. The UNCRPD demands no less. But critically, we need to move to a point where there's actually proper governance of these processes. Even if we think of boards of management who will have oversight of these allocation models within their schools, how many have any training or understanding in disability? Very often, the experiences of our families can jar or even conflict with the majority or the preferences or the priorities of the mainstream families. We need to have very clear safeguards and governance to actually protect the investment that is in place.
I don't know if anybody else wants to contribute. Dervla, yeah.
Deputy, just to your points about, how we move forward and develop a better system for all children, and that's clearly what's needed here. And I suppose one of the telling pieces, and it's not just Inclusion Ireland who are saying this or other advocacy organisations who are saying this, it's actually the UN who are telling the state about it as well, is that currently we don't have any data about the educational outcomes for disabled children in Ireland. We have an overall league table which places us very high, and compares us to other countries and says that we're doing very well in our education system. But actually we know that there's kids who are falling through the cracks every day of the week within that. So we really need to start measuring what the educational outcomes are for children who are receiving this investment from the state as the state sees it, and look at what children are coming out with at the end of their education experience. And we don't have data and information on that. And I suppose it speaks to a deeper piece as well about how we value children. Do we value all children equally in this state? We're setting children up for failure every day of the week. And I think that's not just down to the resource allocation models that are there. It's also down to how we train, how we support schools, including educators, SNAs, to value difference, to understand difference. I think we live in a very ableist world that has been well documented by advocacy organisations, and we need to unpick a lot of that and understand how do we value difference in our education system. Like, I'll just give you an example. I spoke to a family member a couple of weeks ago who has a daughter who uses a high-tech AAC device to communicate, and she's travelling an hour and a half to go to school every day in a taxi. Now, she is travelling past her local school. So that local school is missing out on the benefit of having that kiddo who communicates in a fabulous way through using this high-tech device, and all the students in that class are missing out on that experience of being educated alongside her, and she's going off to another environment and travelling. Why can't we support that child to be there? Why can't we value that child's place in that school environment? Why can't we see that inclusive education is actually good for every child? It's good for the disabled child, but it's also good for every other child in that classroom setting. So I think there's kind of fundamental principles that we need to address as a society, as well as very practical steps that need to be taken to make inclusion work.
So, sorry, Chair, but I'll just finish on this. I always say that we separate children on the basis of gender, religion, income in our Irish education system, but we're also separating them on the basis of disability. That's a lot.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks.